When World War I breaks out in 1914, it's the Central Powers of Europe, shown here in purple, versus the Allied powers, shown here in red. 4 years later, when the war ended, 15 million people had died and another 20 million people were wounded, largely as a result of some 1800s inventions that were really perfected by the time the war breaks out. The top invention here is the machine gun. It is a little different than the machine guns we have today. It needed to be on a tripod, and it took 4 or 5 guys to operate it. But it had the firepower of 100 guns and was incredibly deadly. Soldiers carried the bolt-action rifle, which had a special loading system that enabled a soldier to fire 15 rounds in a minute and could hit a target 1,500 yards away. And artillery cannons, very large guns that were loaded with shells that would explode on impact. Sometimes they would even carry poison gas in them. The most sophisticated artillery guns could hit targets that were 70 miles away. Also quite deadly were some new inventions, most notably the Zeppelin here in the bottom left, which was an airship that carried bombs, could destroy cities in seconds, and the airplanes, which were also a brand new invention, used for the first time in World War I, used for the first time in warfare in World War I. Originally for surveillance, but later in order to defend against the airships, the airplanes started carrying bombs and guns themselves, and they would do battle with the airships, making things quite dangerous for the soldiers that were driving the airship. In a reaction to all this, the tank is a new invention. It is not quite as successful as people had hoped, but it was an armored vehicle. It was impervious to machine gun fire. It just was incredibly heavy, 14 tons, and moved pretty slowly. Top speeds were just over 3 miles per hour. So not quite the most effective as people had hoped, but still something that was brand new and, did have an impact. All of these inventions led to incredibly widespread destruction in the areas around the fighting. These weapons also led to a stalemate in the land war that developed into a type of warfare called trench warfare. Both sides really dug in, and ultimately, as the war progressed, these trenches became very sophisticated, with your front line trenches being supported with communication and supply trenches behind them. The trenches were often not particularly deep. In some cases, men had to stoop down and walk very, slow and carefully, or they would be hit by firepower that's going over their heads. In between the two trenches was an area referred to as no man's land, pretty much a man-made desert. Occasionally, men would be called upon to charge into no man's land and attempt to take on the enemy's trench, and they would go into this area with a helmet and a gun, very little protection. The trenches were incredibly dangerous, and men did whatever they could to protect themselves. They would try to make the trenches a little higher if it was impossible to dig them deeper without, just hitting water. And of course, the use of periscopes was very crucial. When men were going to charge into the enemy's trench, it was said to be going over the top of the trench. And as you can see from this picture, men didn't usually get very far when facing off against machine gun fire. As a result of the war being a stalemate, the Germans in particular tried to break the stalemate with the use of submarine warfare. Submarines did pose a serious threat. It's a pretty new invention still. They could only stay submerged for a few hours, but they carried torpedoes and they did have the ability to sink ships. The other thing the Germans started using, and then others quickly followed suit, was poison gas, chlorine gas and mustard gas. If you remember, the Germans were quite skilled with science and technology, and in fact, by the time World War I starts, 80% of chemicals are produced in Germany. These gases are very, very deadly.